Here is the complete guide to every single running back, the top 45 with their rankings and start sits in this video. Make sure to hit that like button as we get into it and subscribe if you do like these rankings, but I don't waste people's time. Number one, we're going to group these S tier players together a little bit. We have Saquon Barkley as the RB1 this week. He's number one in rushing yards, number one in rushing touchdowns. He gets a matchup against the Buccaneers this week, which isn't insanely positive, but they're likely going to be without Vita Vea and some of their interior guys, so it should be a lot easier. You're going to be starting all of these guys in the S tier regardless. Number two is going to be Breece Hall. He does get a little bit of a split with Braylon Allen over the past 2 weeks. I will get into that later in the video. Not enough for me to worry. It's a great matchup against the Denver Broncos. They're top 10 in points allowed to opposing running backs. He obviously gets a ton of work in the receiving game, and Aaron Rodgers is only getting more used to playing NFL football off his injury with this new team. RB3 in the S tier here is Alvin Kamara, a guy that has proven to be one of the best running backs in fantasy football. He has 110 total yards and 20 touches every single game. The Saints starting center is also moving to IR, which is going to hurt this team a little bit, especially the run game. But Alvin Kamara should be able to bounce to the outside and be used more in the pass catching outside of the backfield. So I'm not too worried about it. The receiving upside is obviously going to keep his floor very, very high. We've seen that so far this year. And next up, we're going to have Bijan Robinson on the other side of the ball getting the Saints in this matchup. It is a divisional game, so it should be closer. These divisional games usually just tend to be closer. And similar to Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins is only being more healthy off his injury, playing NFL football with a new team. They're only going to get better as the season goes on. They looked decent last week in the past two. Last in this S tier, we have Kyren Williams coming into a great matchup against the Bears, who got destroyed by the Colts running backs last week. It's a top 5 matchups as far as fantasy points allowed to running backs this year goes, so it's going to be a great start regardless. Moving down to the A tier though, we're going to have Jordan Mason. He's averaging 20 rush attempts a game and is actually increasing his routes run out of the backfield as well, which is what we started talking about in the beginning of the year when Christian McCaffrey originally started missing time. If he starts getting that receiving role, he's going to be a top 5 guy locked in every week, and that's starting to kind of pile in now. It's not going to be instant, but it is happening. He also does get a good amount of goal line work. He didn't score a touchdown last week, but he did have 4 rushing attempts in the red zone. We love to see that because the Patriots are not a good offense. They should stay very run heavy, even if their defense is relatively good. But speaking of bad games, James Conner is going to be next up in this list, which might seem a little bit high coming off his game last week where he had 3 fantasy points, one of his lowest outings since 2021 where he played fully healthy in a game. To be fair, it was a really tough matchup against the Detroit Lions run defense. They are bottom 3 in points given to opposing running backs. Now he gets the Commanders, who are 12th, I believe, in points allowed to running backs. Almost top 10, but their entire defense in general is pretty bad. And Jahmyr Gibbs next up in the A tier here in a matchup against the Seahawks, who is a pretty tough one as far as fantasy points allowed to running backs. But historically, if we look at the past 3-ish games that they've played against each other, it's almost always a high-scoring game. So if we're going to have big scoring potential, the sportsbooks also have this projected for one of the higher-scoring games of the week. There's a lot of opportunities for Jahmyr Gibbs. They do have some interior linemen that is going to be missing this week. That does worry me as far as the inside run game, but we do know Jahmyr Gibbs, he runs to the outside, he gets a lot of work out of the backfield. That's more of an issue for David Montgomery than it is for him. I will also get into later in this video. Jahmyr Gibbs is a fine start this week against the Seattle Seahawks. And to finish out this A tier, Jonathan Taylor against the Steelers. This one is tough because the Steelers are the number 1 defense in allowing fantasy points to running backs. They're very, very tough as far as giving them out. Richardson / this entire Colts offense really has not been up to par for what we've expected. In 2 out of his last 3 games, he's gone under 10 completions, which is not great. We do have to remember he still hasn't played a full NFL season's worth of games yet. This offense will put it together eventually. It's just a question of when. I don't necessarily see that all going together to be right this week against the Steelers, but if it does look a little bit better every week, Jonathan Taylor is still running behind one of the best offensive lines. But another guy moving up our rankings for this week specifically is going to be Brian Robinson. Austin Eckler did not travel with the team to Arizona. He is ruled out with a concussion, which means Brian Robinson is this clear-cut RB1 with absolutely no backfield competition. If the Commanders even see half of the offensive success that they saw last week against the Bengals, Brian Robinson is going to outperform his projections in pretty much every way. Austin Eckler being out of this offense means there's 5-ish targets a game freed up on top of all the rushing usage he already sees. We do have Jane Daniels being a risk to taking some rushing touchdowns, but it looks like he's producing. We also have Derrick Henry this week against the Bills. This one is a little bit tough because we do have the potential of this game script not going the right direction for Derrick Henry. The Ravens could go down early, which means Justice Hill is going to be that RB1, which we've seen in previous weeks. The Bills just put up 40 on the Jaguars. Now, to be fair, the Jaguars team is nothing like the Ravens. They actually have a pretty good defense. And Derrick Henry is pretty much a lock to score a touchdown every week, despite what the game script is, as long as they get in that red zone. But the Bills' run defense isn't impossible to produce against. It's just a possibility of the Bills scoring a bunch and then getting down in the game. But next up on the other side of the ball is going to be James Cook, who does get a tough matchup. The Baltimore run defense is very tough. They're averaging less than 3 yards per carry given to opposing running backs this year. The good news is that James Cook gets a ton of usage in the receiving game out of the backfield. He runs a ton of routes, which is very, very good to keep his floor high. There's always that risk of Josh Allen stealing a touchdown, which we did see some of last week. And looking at Devon Achane next up here, this is entirely dependent on the quarterback situation. If we have Skylar Thompson, Achane is fine at this ranking. But if we have Tim Boyle or Tyler Huntley, he's going to move down a considerable amount. It just comes down to this offense being able to move, and Skylar Thompson is their best bet at that. He is still limited. It's not 100% that he's good to go. For some good news, I guess, for Devon Achane, it looks like Mostert is going to be missing this game as well, and he does get a good amount of receiving upside, so he should relatively have a safe floor. It just depends on what that offense is going to look like. Josh Jacobs coming in as the next running back here. He only put up 5 fantasy points last week, but to be completely fair, there was a 2-touchdown difference at one point in this game, and he only saw 50% of the snaps. So if you're not going to be on the field and you're going to use a secondary running back in Emmanuel Wilson, you're not going to get a ton of usage anyways. This is a tougher matchup against the Vikings. They allow the 8th least points to opposing running backs this year, and we do have the possibility of Jordan Love coming back, which he most likely will. It will elevate this offense, and they could get up early, meaning that Josh Jacobs is going to get a lot more usage. But then we have Aaron Jones coming off the other side of the ball again. He gets a good matchup against the Packers defense, a revenge game for him, if you will. He's seen a ton of usage in the receiving game, a ton of usage on the ground in general. This offense has looked way better than expected. There's really not a whole ton of red flags, and the Vikings have had 2 really tough matchups the last 2 weeks as far as fantasy points given up to running backs in the 49ers and the Houston Texans as well. So this matchup here that is tough doesn't really scare me. And David Montgomery is another guy that's been seeing a whole ton of success, more than people expected, alongside Jahmyr Gibbs. He's pretty much outscored him through 3 weeks here. We do have this center being injured this week for the Lions, which does scare me for the inside run game, so it does hurt David Montgomery more than it does Jahmyr Gibbs. But going back to the other points, this should be a high-scoring game. The Seattle Seahawks run defense is pretty good, but if this game script goes to plan, he will be a fine start again. Then we have Zach Moss. This isn't a guy being ranked this high because of last week. He did get a garbage time touchdown, not necessarily, but it was technically garbage time because it was a free touchdown. So that's not moving him up, but he does get a great matchup here against the Panthers. He saw 76% of the snaps last week with 17 total touches. He gets a good amount of work in the receiving game as well. This Panthers defense is not amazing. They are missing some defensive linemen, so I'm firing up where I can. Zach Moss in this matchup. Chase Brown is decent in the touches that he does get, but as of right now, he's not getting enough to be categorized as one of those red flags for Zach Moss. Later down the line of the season, yeah, he will be, but not right now in week 4. And moving it down, we have Tank Bigsby, who does have some real red flags. Speaking of that, because this Jaguars offense is so bad, that is his main issue. It's not even Tank Bigsby taking usage. That's the big problem. It's that this offense can't move, and they don't look good. Because you look at his underlying numbers, he gets a good amount of usage in the receiving game, about 4 to 5 targets a game. He gets decent rushing attempts. He's very efficient. He's averaging 5 yards per carry. It's just a matter of time until this offense can actually figure it out. I'm not saying this is going to be the week because it is a tough matchup against the Houston run defense. They're probably going to be playing behind, so I don't love it. But our next guys here is going to be Kenneth Walker, Najee Harris, and Chuba. With Kenneth Walker, it entirely depends on his injury discretion. He is limited in practice. It looks like he might play. If he is going to come into this game limited, he's going to be moved down a good amount in these rankings. The good thing about the Seahawks is that they're usually pretty transparent on the usage. They've been saying that Kenneth Walker is going to be put back into this offense slower, which is why he's missed 2 weeks for an injury that doesn't seem insanely severe. But again, that does depend on if he's going to actually play. If he doesn't, Zach Charbonnet is going to still stay in this ranking here. And next up, Jaylen Warren is dealing with the same hamstring injury that he was in the beginning of the season, and it doesn't look like he's going to play in this week's matchup. So that makes Najee a very, very good start this week. If you do have him, I'm putting him in my starting lineup. He gets a pretty decent matchup against the Colts there, not a negative one by any means. He saw 18 carries last week and 5 targets out of the backfield in a Steelers offense that is 3-0 and are looking pretty decent. So I have no worries about Najee Harris if Warren misses. And Chuba, he's coming obviously off a great game from the Andy Dalton experience last week. He gets a matchup against the Bengals, which is a pretty neutral one as far as points allowed to running backs goes. I do expect this offense to take a little bit of a step back just because now we have film on Andy Dalton with this offense and what the coaching staff wants to do. So I don't expect them to put anywhere near 30 points up, but it's a decent matchup. He should be fine. He gets work out of the receiving game as well, and there's no other running back in this backfield to take carries yet until Jonathan Brooks comes back. That's a story for another day. Cam Akers is going to be next here, who is another pretty decent start this week if you are looking for it. Joe Mixon likely to be out this week. Dameon Pierce likely to be out this week. If they are both missing, Cam Akers is going to be a fine play. I know he didn't put up a ton of fantasy points last week. He put up 9.9, I believe. He got saved by a touchdown. That entire offense just looked bad, though. It was not his fault. It was more of a CJ Stroud thing. This is a better matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. They are positive in every single facet of the defense. Fantasy points allowed to running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends, everything. Cam Akers and this offense should dominate and have a run-heavy script. Cam Akers will be fine if both of those guys are missing. If Pierce or if Mixon or both of them are in, it's going to be a different story though. So make sure to drop your comments on what players you're starting and sitting, and I will be in there answering everybody's as usual. And then we have Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, and J.K. Dobbins. It looks like Stevenson is going to be a game script dependent running back, which does make a lot of sense. If Jacoby Brissett cannot move this ball and can't create offense, Ramondre Stevenson is going to take a hit from that. We saw it last week against the Jets. They put up 3 points. The offense was not moving whatsoever, and we had Ramondre Stevenson put up 0.3 fantasy points. Now, is it going to be that bad? No, because the Jets defense is really good. This week's matchup isn't anywhere near as bad. The 49ers are actually a pretty positive run defense so far this year, which is surprising to say, but if you look at the numbers, they haven't been too bad. And Tony Pollard, he saw his lowest usage of the year last week with only 10 touches. Tajay Spears, I do expect to get a lot more usage as the season goes on, but for right now, Pollard is still going to be a flex viable guy. He gets a matchup against the Dolphins, which if we don't have Skylar Thompson and it's Tim Boyle or Tyler Huntley, is going to be a lot better because the Titans can actually utilize their run game, which can't really happen that often because they're losing in games, but the quarterback situation is going to hurt the Dolphins a ton, and it should be a positive matchup for these running backs because the Dolphins can't stop running backs either, on top of that fact. And J.K. Dobbins is also pretty much entirely dependent on Justin Herbert's injury discretion. If he is missing this game, I honestly would not be upset if you sat J.K. Dobbins because Herbert is pretty much everything to this offense. They're not great in general, but Herbert is holding them together. They get a tough matchup against the Chiefs this week as well, who are averaging and allowing 3.3 yards per carry to running backs this year. That is scary, especially if you're not going to have a solid weapon at quarterback keeping this offense moving. So J.K. Dobbins, the good news is that he's outscoring and outproducing Gus Edwards more and more and more every single week to make that case for the true RB1, which he really is at this point. But if we don't have Herbert, this offense is going to struggle, and I don't like the run game. The Chiefs are very tough against running backs. And if you're wondering where Rachaad White is, he's showing his face here now in these rankings. He had decent usage last week, 12 total touches, still only averaging 2 yards per carry throughout this entire season. And this isn't anything new. Last year, he was very, very inefficient as well. There was just no backfield competition. If you guys have been on this page or seen these videos for long enough, I've talked about this so many times. It's coming to fruition. Now he actually has a good backfield competition guy in Bucky Irving, which I will talk about later in these tiers as well, so make sure to stick around for that. He's relying on his receiving usage on a week-to-week basis, and the coaches have come out and said that Bucky Irving has earned himself more usage in this offense, which is a very bad sign for Rachaad White. He gets a matchup against the Eagles, which is pretty positive against wide receivers, but a little bit more negative against the running back. So it's not like it's a great matchup, and he does have backfield competition. I am very worried for him this week, but his receiving upside should keep him viable if he gets that. It's just a big risk. Then Jerome Ford, who's been in a pretty interesting backfield situation because you don't have Donta Foreman, then you do have Foreman, then Foreman doesn't exist again. We really don't know what to expect out of this backfield at this point. But he does get a great matchup against the Raiders this week, who are allowing 20 fantasy points to running backs so far this year. They allow the 31st most points to opposing running backs, almost last. They're very, very positive so far this year. So if Jerome Ford can actually act as this RB1 and we don't see a surprise performance from Foreman, he should be fine. And I'll group these next running backs here together for you guys. Braylon Allen, Carson Steele, DeAndre Swift, and Bucky Irving. The land of the handcuff running backs, if you want to say that. Braylon Allen has looked really, really good. In his last 2 weeks, he's averaging 14 fantasy points. Now, we do have to be fair. He has scored touchdowns in those games, but he's been increasing his usage and actually been looking like a very viable guy. Now, does that mean he's a startable guy every week? I wouldn't say so. The touchdowns have been saving his fantasy points in a sense, and obviously Breece Hall is this RB1 regardless, but I do not expect the Broncos to have any type of offense here in this matchup, so if the Jets go up big, they could lean on the run game a ton more, and if it is a blowout, then Braylon Allen will probably get a good amount of usage on top of that. And Carson Steele is also a bit of a risk depending on the situation with Kareem Hunt. If he is activated and ready to go in this offense for week 4, I'm going to be moving him down out of my rankings. But we don't have him for now, and Carson Steele is pretty much a lock to get all of this rushing upside. He saw a good amount of usage last week on the ground. It is a decent matchup as well against the Chargers. Swift is another wildcard running back at this point. Last week we saw more involvement from Roschon Johnson than ever so far this season. He saw 37% of the snaps, 8 carries. That can continue throughout the rest of the season. Is it going to be a big worry as far as week 4? I can't say that. But as far as the rest of the season goes, Roschon Johnson is a guy I am stashing. If you guys haven't seen that video, I posted a video of the must-stash players. I'll pin it. But it is a great matchup against the Rams, who are allowing top 10 points to opposing running backs this year. Without Aaron Donald, the run defense is really struggling. So it should be positive if Caleb Williams can keep this offense rolling and actually involve the running backs. He gets a good amount of usage out of the backfield as far as targets go as well. So as long as Roschon Johnson doesn't come in and take 50% of the snaps, Swift should be okay as far as this backfield and this team goes. And Bucky, he's great. He's averaging 6.2 yards per carry. This is very good compared to a 2 yard per carry at Rachaad White. He's earned more targets. He's earned more usage. That's everything the coaches have been saying. Over the course of the season, he is going to be more and more involved. If he's still on your waivers somehow, please pick him up before this week. Next in this tier, we have Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Spears, and Zamir White. All of these guys have a good amount of red flags themselves. Javonte Williams is technically the RB1, despite Jaleel McLaughlin coming in and stealing a touchdown. No, I'm saying he's stealing it because he didn't really. Javonte Williams got the carry, and he pretty much scored a touchdown, but the ref said no. I mean, we all thought it was a touchdown, and then McLaughlin comes in and takes it from him. So I'm not really taking that as a red zone carry as far as away from Javonte Williams' usage, but it is still a very real situation that he is taking his usage, which is not great, especially when your offense isn't moving as well as it should, and it's a tough matchup against the Jets defense, given their pass defense is a lot better than their run defense. Still not positive. And Perine is also going to be dependent on Kareem Hunt's status if he is playing. It does affect Carson Steele more than it does Samaje Perine because his involvement is almost primarily in the receiving game. And Spears, with this entire Titans run offense, should have a better matchup this week against the Dolphins. They are positive against running backs this year. Spears is one of those guys that's going to get more usage as the week goes on, but I expect Tony Pollard to get a majority of this upside in this matchup. And then Zamir White, at this point, he should not be started with confidence at all. I've put him in videos to tell you to drop him here. He gets a tough matchup against the Cleveland Browns. He only saw 22% of the snaps last week. I am blaming that a little bit more on the Andy Dalton experience and the fact that the Panthers put up 30-plus points on them. And they put Alexander Mattison in the game a little bit more because of that, because of his receiving upside there. And Zamir White should see more snaps. He should see more rushing upside as well. Maybe a little bit in the passing game, but nowhere near a startable guy that we want to have confidence in. But that is going to finish this video off. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one coming very, very soon.